All right, we're recording. We're beginning. Judy, I hope you can hear us soon. No flicker of comprehension yet. Okay. Anyways, we're going to be starting on page 82, recycling everything. So it's been a couple of weeks now. The last section that we covered was God is no mathematician on the previous page. And he is really going after this theme of surrender. And of course, this section is on suffering, suffering and surrender. So everything is relating to that. And we're going to really be getting into it tonight. And I don't know if we'll get two little sections done. Probably not, because we never do. But they are kind of short, so we'll see. Um, I know it's been 2 weeks. Is there anything that anybody wanted to bring up before we jump into the new material? Probably totally forgot everything that we've been talking about all last year in 2 weeks, right? It's as if
Pretty easy at
last
this
year
age.
didn't even happen, right?
Actually, I missed this not meeting for 2 weeks. That was
It
too
was
long.
weird, wasn't it? And that's the first
Yeah,
time we've ever done 2 full weeks, just because of the way the holidays fell on our actual Zoom days. But yeah, 2 weeks was too much,
it's too much.
too much. Usually it's only a week. Okay, let's get into it. Recycling everything. Jesus says, there's only one sign I'm going to give you, the sign of the prophet Jonah. Sooner or later, life is going to lead us, as it did Jesus, into the belly of the beast, into a situation that we can't fix, can't control, and can't explain or understand. That's where transformation most quickly happens. That's when we're uniquely in the hands of God. It's God's waiting room. Suffering is the only force strong enough to destabilize the imperial ego. The separate and sufficient self has to be led to the edge of its own resources until it learns to draw upon its deepest source. Various forms and times of suffering and love gradually move us toward who we are in God and who God is in us. The genius of Jesus' teaching is that he reveals that God uses tragedy, suffering, pain, betrayal, and death itself, not to wound us, but in fact to bring us to a larger identity. Unless the single grain of wheat loses its shell, it remains just a single grain. The shell must first crack for the expanded growth to happen. In such a divine economy, everything can be transmuted, everything can be used, and nothing is wasted, not even our mistakes. This is God's ultimate and merciful recycling process. Okay, any initial reactions or anything stand out before we dive back in? Judy, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can.
Ah,
Can you
okay, you
hear
just
me?
missed, all you missed was the initial reading. So
Okay.
we'll be going back to it.
Uh,
Um, yeah, any initial reactions to anybody? Especially, yeah, Judy, what's your initial reaction? Come on.
I haven't read the thing yet. And you're very funny. Are
Yeah,
you
yeah,
on
yeah.
82? Let me just make sure of that.
82, yes.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Recycling everything. All right. Was there anything from any of y'all?
Mhm.
And so, what's the sign of Jonah?
The sign of Jonah. That's when the Pharisees are asking for a sign. By what authority do you do these things? And they're asking for a sign. And he tells them, you're not going to get one except the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is that Jonah went into the belly of the sea monster for 3 days before he was spat back out on shore. And so Jesus is using that as the symbol. We can also say it's the symbol of his descending into the tomb for 3 days and coming back at the other side to the resurrection. But basically, he's talking about the fact that there has to be a descent before an ascent. A lot of the debate that was going on in that context was how the Pharisees believed that um, they were the children of Abraham and they were God's elect, pretty much by right of birth, by where they were born and their pedigree and all of that. And so they were feeling very entitled, and they were feeling very powerful, and they were trying to put Jesus on the spot. And so the sign of Jonah was meant to say, there's going to be a reckoning. There's got to be a humbling. There has to be a letting go of everything that you think you control and all the trappings of your power before you're ever going to be able to get to the state of being that he calls kingdom. And so, yeah, you're not going to get a sign. There's not going to be any certainty. I'm not going to, call down legions of angels from heaven so that you can be certain of what's going on. It's an interior process. How's that, Ellen? That help? Okay. Well, let's back up and let's take it line by line or so. So there's only one sign. I'm going to give you the sign of the prophet Jonah. So that's Jesus to the religious leaders of his time. Now back to Richard saying, sooner or later, life is going to lead us, as it did Jesus, into the belly of the beast, into a situation that we can't fix, can't control, and can't explain or understand. That's where transformation most quickly happens. That's when we're uniquely in the hands of God. It's God's waiting room. Okay, we've talked along this theme a lot in Rohr's writing, both in Falling Upward and here in Just This. It probably goes into, it was there in Everything Belongs that we read, I don't know how many years ago now. But it's still, I think, a difficult point for many of us. Do you really believe that being led into the belly of the beast, getting into a place of loss, trauma, these challenging, difficult times, a situation that we can't control or fix, is that where transformation really happens? And why? Why is that the situation? Why is it in these situations that the transformation happens most quickly?
Well, we could explore that, but I also want to consider, does God lead us there?
No, that's another great point. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're humbled to our knees in many cases at that time. So hence the next sense, which we haven't gotten to, the ego goes to the side and you are humbled and maybe brought to your knees on something. So you've got to maybe face it in a different way or grow differently than you ever thought you would.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm going to hit your question there, or your topic, Danielle, in the third paragraph. So we'll hold on to that in just a second, because he hits that a little bit harder down in that paragraph, but it's a point well taken. So are you all buying that we absolutely need what he is calling necessary suffering in the next section, and has called it that in earlier, I think, in this book, and also certainly in Falling Upward? Are you buying that we need this suffering, we need these type of situations in order for us to grow?
I think so.
Yeah?
Yeah, definitely. I think when we're complacent or when things are just fed to us and given to us, we don't even try to change. It's when we're pressured into something. And I can just take my job as an example. And Dave, you've even told me that you've seen such change in me. But before I started retail, I had no idea what people were really like out there. And yeah, and it's been it's been a love and hate kind of thing for me, and it's made me grow in so many ways. It's made me appreciate kindness in people. It's made me kinder to people. I have more compassion for people and what they go through, and I can see now when people are hurting or when they're happy, or just I took so much for granted before, and I think it's through the struggle of the last few years for me that it's just really opened my eyes a lot, and it's really changed my heart. But that's me.
Great points, though.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do any of the rest of you have any stories similar where it was a period of very, great difficulty that really grew you, that you were able to learn from?
Well, for me, that would have been the passing of my son. It caused me to grow in ways I couldn't imagine. As you said, it just was so foreign, all the feelings, because I've never had to experience them other than my grandmother. She was 92 years of age, so she was kind of expected that she was wearing thin on how many days were left in her life. But when your son, in the middle of his life, decides to go off on another grand adventure off of planet Earth somewhere and on to whatever comes next, and you're left with your feelings and your thoughts and your fears and your concerns and your sadnesses and all those different things. And I thank God that He was able to guide me through. I avoided a lot of heartache by comparison to what I've seen other people go through who have lost loved ones unexpectedly. So I received a lot of grace, and I was very grateful for that.
Mm-hmm.
You find out whether you really believe in grace or whether it's just something you read out of a book.
Have any of you ever heard of a limit situation? A limit situation.
What you mean? You just have a limit and then you snap?
It's something like that.
Okay.
Carl Jaspers is the one who came up with the term. And a limit situation is a situation we find ourselves in that puts us at the limit of our ability to control, the limit of our ability to understand and make any meaning out of it. And so literally it's bringing us to the precipice of everything we think we know, everything that we have used to date in order to survive, to control, to work to advantage. It's basically our whole worldview, everything. To come to the end of all of that and not see anything in front of us except the abyss is a limit situation. I think there are people in Pacific Palisades who are experiencing a limit situation right now. Nina, in her illness, is experiencing limit situations. Whenever we get to the point, what Scott was just talking about with the death of his son, a limit situation. Marion and retail, I think there were moments at the checkout stand where she did experience a limit situation with some of the folks coming through, but that's what they are. And so why is there necessary suffering? It's because if we don't get to the point of running out of everything that we use to imagine that we have control over our situation, our life, our environment, if we don't get to the end of our sense of meaning, then, as Marion said, there is no motivation to change a thing. Why would we? Everything's working so far. But life is endlessly serving up limit situations. There's going to be no shortage of them coming to us in one shape, way, or form. Whether it's loss, whether it's the death of a loved one, whether it's the loss of a job, whether it's a wildfire, whatever it happens to be, there's going to be nothing but a series of limit situations as long as we're drawing breath. And how we understand that and how we see that has everything to do with whether we are going to use these limit situations to actually grow us, or if we are going to resist them to the point that we're going to pull back and try to go back to the last time we felt secure and just build our walls thicker. Because those are the choices we have. A limit situation is the call to the hero's journey, if you want to think of it that way. The wounding that always precedes the beginning of the hero's journey. It's the wounding that is calling us into the next world that we don't understand, that we don't have any meaning system for. When Dorothy opens the door and everything turns color in Oz, she has no way to make meaning out of what she's seeing there. She's not in Kansas anymore. It's the path that she takes through the journey as she accepts the challenges, accepts the hope of the guides and the teachers that come, the gifts that they give her, like ruby slippers and so on and so forth. It is the building up of her own intelligence and courage and compassion in the guise of her three traveling companions. That is the process along the way, so that when she ends up back in Kansas, she knows the place differently than she did before. That's what each limit situation is affording us, what it's offering us, what the opportunity is. But if we only see it as suffering, if we only see it as a curse, if we only are crying out, "Why me, Lord?" Then we're never going to be able to use it for the potential growth that it can represent. Not that we're going to be able to see all that in the moment of the trauma. And that's really important for us to understand. This kind of meaning making doesn't happen in the moment. It's going to happen afterwards, after you've gone through the curve of the grieving process and come back down to ground. Then you can start to see what you've been able to accomplish in just breathing through it, and how you can remake the meaning that accommodates the loss, accommodates the changed circumstances of your life. But even through the trauma itself, if there's something that is in the back of our minds, in the core of our being, that lets us know that this isn't just a curse, nobody would want to go through that trauma. But now that it's here, you know, if I know that if I push, if I lean into it, if I don't retreat from it, if I allow myself to feel, if I stay connected, if I push through, that there's going to be something on the other side that I will see as a blessing. And eventually, maybe even be grateful that it was pain enough to be able to move me in this new direction. Just like that old timer who says he was grateful for being an alcoholic. Just like I can look back on my divorce and say, although I'd never wish it on my worst enemy, at least I'm grateful that something in my life was painful enough that it caused me to start asking the right questions of life. And so changing our attitude towards suffering, changing our attitude toward the traumas of life is key to us to be able to move through them in such a way that we are constantly drawing nearer to God and God's presence. And that's what he's talking about when he says we're uniquely in the hands of God. It's God's waiting room. Now, yeah, there's also an implication there that God is bringing this stuff to us, and we're going to hit that in just a little bit. But that's a complete change in focus that we're going to need to hit if we're ever going to be able to successfully move through life and remain living in kingdom. Okay, I just threw a lot of words at that. Thoughts?
Dave, can I add a thought there?
Absolutely.
When I think of Jonah, I think of he was avoiding addressing a situation that was clear to him.
Mhm.
And it seems like to me that, there's clearly things that we don't control, but there's many things that we can, I guess, make choices to address, whether it's a conflict or confronting something that we've kind of buried our head in the sand about, or just become complacent about. There's kind of a what's the word for it? A choice of applying ourselves in certain areas so that we're not so ill-equipped when things do broadside us.
Mhm.
I probably the first time I was thinking about this was when I was in architecture school. We used to call it architecture, and I'm like, why am I doing this? And I'm having to pay for this. At the same time, it's just like, but or public speaking, or you've got somebody at work that's just an absolute jerk, but you have to work it out with them. A book I read was How to Have Difficult Conversations. That's the last book I wanted to read, but the reality is it was preparing for the inevitable people that you run into in life. And then there are things that clearly happen that, sideswipe us that we can't prepare for. You don't practice killing people just so you can practice how to grieve a death. It's just not. Anyway, I just, I think of Jonah. I think of Jonah, and I think of, well, that's an example to me also of him burying his head in the sand and trying to ignore something that God was clearly calling him. And he needed to go through that descent in order to say, Uncle,
Mhm.
willing to, you know, God's hand was obvious. And
And,
most
and you, You know, what's interesting about what you just said, Bill, is you're talking about being things you can't prepare for. Well, a limit situation represents something that you cannot prepare for. That's the whole point. If you
Okay.
could prepare for it, then it wouldn't be a limit situation.
Yeah.
You know, it comes and it hits you in a place that you just, you know, even if you saw it possibly coming, you're still completely unprepared for where it takes you. It takes you right to that precipice. And you're right. Jonah was being led to a limit situation and he was refusing to go. He was running away. You know, he was being asked by God to do something that he could not even, you know, entertain. And so he's running from it. He was running from the hero's journey rather than accepting the call. And so, but because of that, he goes into the descent and comes out the other side. Even though he still went grudgingly, right? He wasn't happy about it, but he did go. And it's interesting. Jonah is the only prophet to whom the people actually listened, as recorded in Scripture. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But I think there's some truth to maybe some of what you're saying, Bill, too, is that, you know, we don't necessarily go willingly with this because, I mean, I can remember situations where when I was younger and probably more stupid, and you fight back, you push back, you do a lot of really dumb stuff. And then over time you get wiser and you sort of see the way the world really is, and you get less stressed out and excited over these things you can gladly sit back in your chair and watch the young people get all excited and start fighting the fight, you know, and you just say, sometimes it is what it is. There is a time to fight, but there's a time to just sit back and say, this is how it is. Let's make the best of it. We don't have control over this. And, you know, you learn, but there are times where you just don't want to give in to that. You think you have a reason or a principle to fight for, you know. So maybe it's age and wisdom. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of that comes with sage, right?
Well, a lot of people just get older. They don't get wiser. You know, it has to,
That is true.
are you using the experiences of your life to develop the wisdom? In other words, are you letting these limit situations, are you letting these times of trauma actually teach you? Are you learning the grace, you know? And as Marion said, learning the compassion, learning the grace, learning to be patient with people and the unfinished business that they're all processing or not processing and facing and you know, projecting outward. So yeah, it's that kind of idea that time heals all wounds. Well, no, it doesn't. It does take time to heal, but only if you're willing to actually do the work. And so it comes back to that over and over again.
Well, and you do sometimes, you know, you'll congratulate yourself at some point in your life when you say, I have a lot of battle scars from this kind of stuff when I did it a certain way. And now I have more grace about it. I understand the process a little better. I can grow from that. I can realize how strong I am or maybe how weak I was at a certain point. So you're right. You do learn, but you don't see it right away in the beginning. You see it much later.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you may see it and you just don't like it.
Exactly.
Painful.
Gosh darn it, I can't control this.
Yeah. It's always been fascinating to me that other people will tend to see the changes in you before you see them in yourself. You'll get comments, you know, that you've changed or whatever that they see. But it's in fact, I suppose if you're waiting for the change and trying to affect the change, that's where you're not actually growing. You're still living in that future space. You're not here in present. And so it's only when you take your eyes off of the change and the outcome and just live the process that it really starts to take shape and form and accelerate. But then you're not the one who's first aware of it. It's really interesting how that works. It's counterintuitive. But that's the way I've experienced it and the way I've read others and talked to others who have experienced it as well. So it's an immersion in the process that will take us to the change. And so when we're in the midst of the trauma, that's not the time to intellectualize it. It's not the time to try to rationalize it, but it is the time to immerse in the moments and the people who share those moments with you. It's not the time to try to retreat from it, but to actually move in and immerse in it. And if we are willing to do that, feel what we need to feel, you know, and allow others to still enter our space and connect with us, then we can't help but grow through it all. And that's the difference. But it all has to do with how we look at this. If we only look at the traumas of life as a curse, and if we have time, I want to play a little video that's going to highlight, hopefully very graphically, the difference in attitudes toward the difficulties of life. We're going to come to very different conclusions. So let's take the next paragraph where he's going to develop this idea. He says, suffering is the only force strong enough to destabilize the imperial ego. Okay, makes sense? I mean, that worldview, that illusory world that our egoic minds create for us is so seamless and so airtight that we don't know that it's an illusion. We don't know that it's a projection. It's like the dreamer inside a dream. You believe that the dream is real because it appears absolutely real to you, unless you can wake up inside the dream. But it's us in our waking life, the ego is creating a dreamscape for us. We're not seeing reality. We're seeing what our egoic mind has concocted for us as as the needs arise for us to be able to continue to believe we have some control and do the things we do and believe what we believe about us and the world, and also what has been imposed upon us, what we've learned in pain, right? Suffering, these traumas are the only force strong enough to destabilize that, to break through, to show the holes in the matrix, if you will. Because just going through life in a comfortable way never is going to crack the shell of that projected world. We need something stronger to be able to do that. And he has said before that great suffering and great love can both do that. We're talking about suffering right now, but suffering definitely is a force that will break through. The separate and sufficient self, that's how we see ourselves. We see ourselves as separate. That's really the original sin. Is that when we achieve self-consciousness and self-awareness, we can conceive of ourselves as separate from. That's original sin. But it's just a necessary part of who we are. It's also the part of us that allows us to actually be able to choose, consciously choose. That means we can love as God loves because we can choose it. But that separate and sufficient self has to be led to the edge of its own resources. That is a limit situation, right? To the limit of its own resources, the edge of its own resources, until it learns to draw upon its deepest source. In other words, until we're finally stripped enough of our unconscious pride to realize that we can't do this on our own. We're not going to be able to pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. Nobody gets through recovery alone. That's why you have to admit that you're powerless and that you're willing to accept and submit to the guidance of a power that's greater than ourselves. It's the same process there. You don't do it on your own, and we don't get through this life on our own. But it's not until we're brought to the edge of our own ability to cope, understand, rationalize, make meaning, that we're finally willing to admit our powerlessness, even if it's not really a conscious admission. It's just a throwing up our hands and realizing, God, I need you, that we're going to draw on our deeper source. Various forms and times of suffering and love, there's he bringing love in here, gradually move us toward who we are in God and who God is in us. Various forms and times of suffering and love gradually move us toward who we are in God and who God is in us. Why do you think that is? If that statement is true, that these various forms and times of suffering and love are what move us toward God, can you put that in a sentence or two? Why would that be true? We sort of already said it. For my money, it's because great suffering and great love cause us to lose our identification with the small self and to re-identify with the beloved. See, we've defined love, Thomas Merton style, as identification with the beloved, not as a feeling and not as a behavior, but actually identifying, being one with the beloved, whoever that happens to be, seeing them as a fellow human being, right? And because we see and we have that identification, that connection, then everything that flows from us behaviorally is going to be loving because we're doing to them what we would want to do to have done to us. And then eventually, through that interaction, the affection and the feelings can follow. But if we're so identified to that voice in our head, if we really think that's who we are, that egoic voice, and the world that that mind has created, then we're never going to be anything but separate. But these times where that shell is cracked causes us to lose identification with self and allows us to re-identify with the beloved and ultimately with God as the ultimate beloved, right? That's why these times of suffering are so important.
Well, if I had to choose a plan between plan A, love, and plan B, so
Wouldn't it be nice if you could choose, huh, Danielle? I hear you, dear. So the genius of Jesus' teaching is that he reveals that God uses tragedy, suffering, pain, betrayal, and death itself not to wound us, but in fact to bring us to a larger identity. And so now we're back to Danielle's question. The way he's putting this, the genius of Jesus' teaching is that it reveals that God uses tragedy, suffering, pain, betrayal, and death, not to wound us, but in fact to bring us to our identity. So riddle me that. Do you think that whatever he means by God uses suffering to bring us to a larger identity, does that mean that God is doing it to us? Lead us not into temptation, right? Begs the question, why would God do that in the first place? And why do we have to pray against it, right?
Well, to me, I see it as I use it. I choose to use it to a greater purpose.
He's saying God uses it, not you.
Well, God gave me that suffering, but then what do I
Did
do
he?
with it?
Do you believe that? God gave you the suffering?
Well, or it's the circumstances. That's how the circumstances happen. Not that he gave it to me, but it's what happened. But then I use that suffering to a greater good for me, for whoever it touches. But it jars me. It's jarring. And that's what happened to me. It was very jarring.
Okay.
It jarred me out of that status quo. So I eventually went to a better purpose.
So you don't believe that God gives us the tragedy itself?
Not that he gives. I don't know that God gives us a tragedy. The tragedy happens.
Okay. Then why doesn't God stop it?
Because to me, he's not a puppet master. He doesn't make things happen or stop things from happening. It happens.
Is that because he can't stop it? Or he won't stop it? And not just isn't just directed to you, Ellen, but to everyone. Danielle has sort of a Cheshire cat look on her face right now.
I think not that he can't or won't. It just doesn't.
That could be construed as an evasion.
You know, I want to ask a question though right now.
All right.
And that is, was Jesus dying on the cross a tragedy?
Yeah. I don't
For
know how
who?
you could
Well, not for
characterize
me.
it any other way.
Well,
tragedy.
And the reason I'm asking is but it was because of that choice that he made, right? That I'm saved. So maybe it was tragedy for him, but it's a blessing for me.
if you choose to make it so, right?
Yeah. Well, no, because regardless if I choose, Jesus was going to die on the cross, regardless of the outcome of me. Because if everything's coming from him anyways, if my faith is from him, if the tragedies that happen in life lead me to make a choice that ultimately encourages or builds my love for God and myself and my fellow brother and sister, how can I label that a tragedy? And I'm sincere in asking the question.
How can you live without a tragedy? Is that what you said?
No, how can I label anything that's happening as a tragedy?
Oh, well,
Help me to see that, because I don't agree.
You could choose a different direction and call yourself a victim and live in that mode. There's always a choice when something happens to us to go one way or the other. And that's, that's the resilience in you, and the choice that you make can either break you or push you forward.
Well, I don't think we have to choose, right? I mean, it is a tragedy, and it's everything it's meant to every Christian who is followed.
The
Like,
choice is how we use it, though. The tragedy. Some people just fall into a victimhood, and that's where they stay forever. Other
yeah,
people take it and take something good from it, like Christ dying for us. He did that for us, and because of that, still we have a choice of salvation or a choice of living without God. So
Yeah,
that's all I
I
meant.
wasn't speaking to that point. I was
Oh,
speaking to the crucifixion itself was a tragic event for Christ.
Right.
Right? And that's a fact. And the fact that it was a blessing for us is simultaneously true. Um, I think of it like, like this whole every crisis is an opportunity kind of thing, where it both sucks and it creates a chance for us to grow at the same time.
I would absolutely agree with that. The crucifixion is a tragedy, any way that you look at it. And it's just as my divorce was a tragedy, even though it had some good effects on me in terms of how I reacted to that pain. It was still a tragedy. It was a tragedy for everyone concerned. These fires in the Palisades are a tragedy, regardless of how people may react to it, regardless of what new directions life may take for some of the people who are suffering right now. These are tragedies. The crucifixion was a tragedy to Jesus. It was a tragedy to his family. It was a tragedy to his followers and everyone who knew him and loved him. It was a tragedy. Now, how we use that to our benefit and to our grace is a beautiful thing, but it's still a tragedy. If it wasn't a tragedy, would it have the power to reshape us based on what we're seeing here in Rohr's page? He says the tragedy is the only thing that has the power that's strong enough to break through that egoic shell. We need that tragedy and able to do that. So, I guess to answer your question, Tony, yes, kind of like William's saying, it's both. It's a tragedy. There's no way that you can say a crucifixion is a good thing. Now we can use it in a way that brings meaning out of it, that helps us and brings us closer to God, or not, but it's still a tragedy. And I don't know if that helps you at all, Tony.
No, it does. No, I think that
Yeah.
closes that. I think that there's more than one thing happening at one time is, and then how I respond and react to that. Um, it really is a choice,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
right?
And then
Well, I
that kind
think
of brings us up to, what I wanted to, I'm sorry, were you going to say something, Judy? Was
yeah,
it?
I think
Oh,
the same
William.
thinking applies to this whole idea of does God lead us into suffering, or you know it it I don't know if we get anywhere if we settle on this thought that you know God burned my house down,
Mhm.
right? Like I, I don't know if that really serves us, but
But here's the thing. We all have to come to some kind of personal theology. We have to come to some sort of personal philosophy that allows us to move through life and explain all the experiences that we're having. So, one way of looking at our relationship with God, with ultimate reality, is that God is a primary actor, that God is the master puppeteer, that God is engineering everything around us and is right here engineering that. He's very, very present, very active. And that is a comforting thought most of the time. But when tragedies occur, it can really wreak havoc with how we look at life. Because when your house burns down in minutes, when you lose a child, when are struck with cancer, all these difficult things that we're seeing around us in people that we know, when those things happen, how do you square that with God? Now, you could try to get very facile with this and say, oh, yeah, God is trying to teach me something, or God is trying to chastise me for something, or God is doing whatever he may be doing. But really, would you as a parent use that kind of tactic to teach your children? Would you create such horrible suffering for them to be able to learn what they need to learn in life? And if we think that we can't use that analogy, remember that Jesus did in the positive. He said, if you know who are evil, you who are incomplete and unripe, if you know how to give good things to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask of him? And so Jesus used that analogy. So I think we can too. Would you really do that? Would love really do that? And if evil can come from God, if tragedy and heartache and the absolute most heinous things and atrocious things that happen in life can come from God, then who is this God that we're trying to serve and love and trust, for crying out loud? So for my money, only good things come from God. And the scriptures talk about every good thing coming from above. And so that means then you have to beg the question, well, then where does the bad come from? And for me, it comes from three sources. It comes from the consequences of my own actions, from the consequences of the actions of others, and then this third category, like wildfires in the Palisades. It's just stuff that happens in the natural world. It's really neither good nor bad. And in fact, in the long run, it's good because life on this planet, life in this universe depends on all of these forces acting the way they do, from viruses to wildfires and hurricanes and earthquakes. We label it good or bad based on whether those actions, those events hinder our agenda. If they do, then we label it bad. If they don't, then we label it good, but they're neither good nor bad. And so that way, God has created the universe in such a way that it has the potential for us to be able to fulfill our purpose here as human beings, as creatures who can choose as God chooses, which means we can love as God loves. And for what we're here to learn, the world, the universe is providing the perfect environment for that because suffering is a part of the learning curve and the learning process. But God isn't doing it to us in my estimation. Now, for some people, that makes God seem too remote. He's not involved in everything that happens to me. And that seems too remote. But for me, it doesn't feel remote that God is still here putting the wind under my wings. He's just not making every little thing happen. So it helps me rather than hinders me. But each one of us is going to have to come up with our own personal theology or philosophy. And then there's going to be a mixed bag. Whatever you believe has things that help you and things that are going to chip away at you at the same time. So pick your poison, but whatever you come up with, as long as it allows you to accept life on life's terms and live with hope and gratitude, as we said so many times, it's true until the next limit situation crops up, and then you're having to start all over again and make new meaning, right? But how we come to terms with these tragedies, whether we think that they're part of our overall growth as human beings or whether there's something heinous, let me play you this little clip. Are you familiar with Stephen Fry? He's an actor, and I mean, he's a great actor and an interesting guy. He's also a bald-faced atheist. And listen to this little clip here, and just see what you think. Hold on.
Is he the crying game guy? That guy, Stephen Fry? No, I'm thinking of somebody else.
Say again now?
I thought he was the guy that was in the crying game. That's a different guy.
No, that's a different guy. Share sound. Oh, they've changed some of this, so hopefully I got this right. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. So if I start this thing, where's the go button?
Suppose what Oscar believed in as he died, in spite of your protestations, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on
No,
that?
but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, and if it was the 12 Greek gods, then I would have more truck with it, because the Greeks they didn't pretend not to be human in their appetites and in their capriciousness and in their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all seeing, all wise, all kind, all beneficent. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac, totally selfish. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable. So, atheism is not just about not believing there's a God, but on the assumption that there is one. What kind of God is he? It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, your life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living, in my opinion.
That sure is the longest answer to that question that I ever...
Aaron, that's very exciting that
Oh my God.
I love it.
You should tell us how he really feels.
Yeah, why did you show us that?
I wanted to show you that because look at the radically different conclusions that you can come to on the subject of suffering. If we can take this one of two ways, but if we do, he represents the most radical conclusion that I've heard on that subject, the way that he presents. And he got in a lot of trouble for that and came back and apologized and, the usual song and dance. But the truth remains, that's where you can go if you look at the suffering of life as being nothing but pure suffering, evil, something that needs to be done away with. Or we can take the more Rohr route and say, okay, it is suffering that also grows us up, and suffering that is the passage through which we can finally crack open the juggernaut of the egoic mind and allow ourselves to connect on a deeper and deeper level, cyclically, more and more and more as we go. But it's so important. And most of us fall somewhere in between. Obviously, we're not where Fry is, but we're also not where Rohr is either. Most of us are somewhere in between. We still are trying to pray away the tragedies that befall us in life. We're trying to avoid them. We cry out to God, why does this have to happen? And in the moment, we're going to do that. My God, why have you abandoned me? Jesus is showing us on the cross that same moment of just abject despair and feelings of abandonment. But then as he recovers in the next breath, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then he comes back to take care of business. Son, here's your mother. Mother, here's your son. You see him moving through. Into your hands I commend my spirit. At Gethsemane and on the cross, we see Jesus going through the whole gamut of moving through the grieving process and getting out to the other side. Not trying to make meaning in every moment, but recovering afterwards and being able to regroup. That's the process. And suffering is an integral part of that. But if we don't see that, to fight and resist it, then we can resist growing and we can get all the way to the side where we see God as a monster. And it's important for us to just realize this is part of the process. And where are we on that spectrum? And how can we move to a healthier and healthier place? That's why I showed you the clip. I ran across that in the Facebook feed, and it was just so striking. And I've never heard Stephen Fry speak on this topic. I've seen him act, and I've just always enjoyed his performances. But that was interesting to hear him speak on that in that way.
Dave, I would say that the people I know that are atheists who don't believe in a God, typically they have that kind of view. Pretty much it's consistent with how could there be a God if this is the kind of horrible things that happens in the world to people that do good things. So yeah, it's a theme, I think, probably with an atheist view. Much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it reminds us of our discussion when I brought to the group on Tuesday about the death of omnipotence, and what is our belief around omnipotence, and seeing God as not a co-collaborator in life, but kind of like us riding on the wings of whatever life invites us into, and walking alongside us, as opposed to a God that created situations in our life to teach us lessons, because life will invite us in all sorts of ways to lessons to be learned and egos to be challenged, But I had to, for me and my personal walk, kind of let go of that whole God, what are you doing type of thing, because I couldn't make heads or tails. It didn't make sense to me. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I have a story. It was in my early Christian days when I belonged to a church that was suffering. I was invited. I was unemployed, and there was a person in the church that made little computer pieces. And so they invited me to the job, and I had to kind of measure the little computer pieces. It was a kind of like, one of those factory jobs. And on the wall in front of me, I had all the suffering quotes, like I'm suffering for the sake of Christ. And I was miserable every day I showed up. But I just believed that I was there because God was refining something in me, and they believed it too. I needed a job. God brought this job into my life, and here I am putting little computer chips together and measuring and being really terrible at the job. And but I believed at that time that God ordained it, and little did I know, looking back, that I didn't really have to take that job. But I was in a community that really held that mindset, that unless there's a lot of value in the suffering.
But that doesn't mean that we have to go looking for it. Right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean if we have a choice that we can't choose otherwise. It's like the limit situations are the unavoidable ones. But if we can avoid suffering and tragedy, well, wouldn't you want to do it? I mean, come on, so we don't need to go looking for it. It will find us. And when it does, it will be inescapable.
Yeah.
And then we need to deal with it, because then we're truly victimized at that moment. We don't have a choice. But in the next breath, we do. What do we do with that choice? I mean, that's really the key here about what we're talking about. But if you believe, just to finish this section, he quotes Jesus, unless the single grain of wheat loses its shell, it remains just a single grain. The shell must first crack for the expanded growth to happen. Again, using agricultural imagery, everybody understands how the seed, the dry husk, dead looking thing, can't germinate and can't become something else until it actually dies as itself and then becomes something else. In such a divine economy, everything can be transmuted, everything can be used, and nothing is wasted, not even our mistakes. This is God's ultimate and merciful recycling process. How you philosophically come down on the issue of suffering, on theodicy, the God's justice and the problem of evil, is going to say everything about your ability to do those two things we talked about: accept life on life's terms and live with hope and gratitude. And where we end up on that spectrum between a monstrous God and a connecting God. So it's an important thing to consider if you haven't already. All right, we are out of time, past time. So this was a good first outing back after 2 weeks, don't you think, Tony?
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions. Ultimately, Jesus modeled for me, or for us, how we choose next.
You know what, Tony? If you do have questions, and like this is heavy stuff. This is a big topic, and write some stuff down, because we'll hit it next week if there's some that are really coming up and continuing to keep you awake at night. Then let's talk about them next time. And that goes for everyone.
Well,
absolutely.
We're not done. We got 2 more pages of suffering to go through after this.
Yeah. There's lots more suffering to be had.
Suffering, so.
Yeah. There is no lack of suffering to be had.
No lack of chapters on it either.
Dave, what's the name of that actor?
Stephen Fry.
Stephen Fry.
Yeah. Stephen with PH and FRY.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Scotty.
Lord, thank you for this time together as we explore and share and learn and grow and just walk into the expansive life that you've got in store for us. Through finding out different meanings of different experiences that we have as we walk through life, and causes us to have these different experiences. And we're just grateful, Lord, that you're, what's the right way to say this, Father? Your design is so perfect that even when the most horrific of things go down, there's always an opportunity to choose what we're going to give to our experience. And we can choose a very tight, very limited life, or we can choose a very expansive life by trusting you and following your direction and learning from reading your word and understanding things more and more as we continue on this grand adventure through life. So we're grateful, Father. We're very, very grateful for the way you see things. And we may not always understand them, but given enough time, we come to an understanding, and you allow for that, and you encourage it, and you provide an environment for it to take place in. So we're grateful, Father. We pray and we give our thanks and we say our amens in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. So if you're here in town, we'll see you Friday night, 6 o'clock for Tres Res, and Sunday morning. If not, we'll see you all next Tuesday night, and be well.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Great session.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night. Good night. Good night. Adieu, adieu, adieu.
Bye, Judy.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Scott.
Bye, Jordana and William.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you guys soon.
Bye.